At Crestview University, the air seemed to shift whenever Chad and Ben walked across the quad. They were the architects of the campus image, the names whispered with reverence in every lecture hall. Chad commanded the Student Ethics Committee with a practiced, steady hand, turning every meeting into a masterclass of moral authority. Beside him, Ben moved with the effortless confidence of a star athlete, his presence alone drawing crowds of admirers. They were not merely students. They were the standard by which everyone else was measured. Their days were a relentless cycle of public virtue. They organized weekend charity drives, mentored struggling freshmen, and sat at the front of every faculty-led seminar. Professors praised their dedication, and peers sought their approval like a currency. They never missed a public service event. They walked through the campus gates each morning as if they owned the very ground they stepped on, their smiles perfectly calibrated. The heavy oak door of apartment 4B acted as a physical boundary between two different worlds. Inside, the air was stagnant, smelling of expensive cologne and leftover takeout. Alex pushed the key into the lock, his shoulders sagging under the weight of a backpack filled with heavy medical textbooks. He dropped his keys on the entryway table and let out a breath he had been holding since his morning shift at the hospital. His feet ached from 6 hours of standing in the clinic, and his eyes burned from staring at anatomy diagrams during his lunch break. While Chad and Ben occupied the living room, sprawled across the sofa with tablets and high-end headphones, Alex navigated the narrow hallway toward the kitchen. He moved with a quiet, deliberate caution, trying to avoid notice. He checked his phone. 2 missed calls from his manager. He ignored them, pulling a small plastic container from his bag, the only meal he had managed to prepare for the next 2 days. He placed it in the refrigerator, his movements slow and methodical. He was a ghost in his own home, a pre-med student whose entire existence was defined by the thin margin between survival and failure. He looked toward the living room, where the laughter of his roommates echoed against the walls, completely untethered from the exhaustion that defined his own reality. Alex returned to the kitchen 3 hours later, hunger finally overriding his fatigue. He opened the refrigerator door, expecting to see the stack of containers he had spent his Sunday night preparing. The shelf was bare. Only a half-empty carton of milk remained. He checked the crisper drawer, then the freezer, moving items aside with increasing urgency. Nothing. He walked into the living room, where Chad and Ben sat with plates of high-end takeout, the smell of fresh food filling the space. Alex pointed toward the kitchen. "My meals are gone. Did you see them?" Chad didn't look up from his tablet. A thin, sharp smirk spread across his face. "We had guests over," Chad said, his voice flat. "They were hungry. Don't be so selfish." Ben laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "It is a minor inconvenience, man. You are acting like we stole your inheritance." Alex stood in the doorway, his hands balling into fists at his sides. The facade of the ethical leader had vanished, replaced by cold indifference. The food incident was not an anomaly. It was the start of a routine. 2 days later, Alex pulled his only dress shirt from the dryer, only to find it soaked in bleach, the fabric stiff and ruined. He stood over the machine, fingers tracing the jagged holes, while Chad and Ben walked past, humming a tune as if he were invisible. The next morning, he reached for the $20 bill. He kept tucked behind his desk lamp for emergencies. The spot was empty. When he asked, Ben simply shrugged, eyes glued to his phone. "Maybe you dropped it, Alex. You are always so scattered." It was a calculated, grinding erosion of his stability. They moved his textbooks into the bathroom, hid his keys in the freezer, and gaslit him every time he tried to voice a complaint. He began to keep his bedroom door locked, but even then he could hear them laughing through the thin walls, their voices sharp with amusement. He sat on his bed, listening to the muffled sound of their music, feeling the walls of the room closing in. He was exhausted, broke, and entirely alone. The Everett Scholarship was the only light on the horizon. It was a merit-based award that would cover his final 2 years of tuition, and finally allow him to quit his night shifts. For 3 weeks, Alex checked the mailbox before anyone else woke up. He tapped it again the moment he returned from his morning lecture. Nothing. The deadline for the announcement had passed 2 days ago, yet his box remained empty. He walked into the living room, where Chad and Ben were reviewing student files. Alex hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Have you seen any mail for me? An envelope from the scholarship committee?" Chad stopped writing. He slowly looked up, his expression unreadable. Ben leaned back in his chair, a slow, deliberate smile forming on his lips. They exchanged a long, knowing glance. "The Everett?" Chad asked, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Alex, let us be honest. That scholarship is for the elite students." Ben chuckled, shaking his head. "Maybe you were not on the list, man." Alex walked back to his room, the door clicking shut behind him. The kitchen was silent when Alex finally emerged to take out the trash. The bag was heavy, leaking a faint, sour smell of old beer and discarded takeout. He hauled it toward the building's disposal chute, his movements mechanical. As he hoisted the bag, the plastic tore against the metal rim, spilling its contents onto the concrete floor. He knelt to gather the mess, his hands brushing against a stiff, rectangular object buried beneath a pile of crushed cans. He pulled it out. It was his envelope. The seal was jagged, ripped open with careless force. Alex wiped the grime from the paper and unfolded the contents. The word, "Congratulations," stared back at him in bold black ink. His pulse spiked, a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He turned the envelope over. The postmark was dated 3 days ago. They had not just ignored his inquiries. They had intercepted his future and discarded it like garbage. He looked at the torn paper, then back toward the apartment door. The realization settled in his chest, cold and heavy. This was not a mistake. It was a deliberate, systematic dismantling of his life for their own amusement. He stood up, the letter gripped tightly in his hand. The crushing weight of his earlier defeat evaporated, replaced by a sudden, terrifying clarity. He did not go back inside. The streetlights flickered as Alex walked, his pace steady and purposeful. The compliant student who had endured months of petty cruelty was gone. He reached an ATM, withdrew his final $100, and stared at the cash in his palm. It was not much, but it was enough for the tools he needed. He bypassed the campus bookstore and headed toward the electronics district. Inside a cramped shop, he traded the bills for high-definition micro-cameras. They were small, designed to be invisible, and perfect for his purpose. He tested the battery life on the counter, his fingers moving with surgical precision. He did not feel anger anymore. He felt a clinical, sharp-edged focus. He walked back to the apartment building, his reflection in the glass doors showing a man who had stopped looking at the ground. He entered the lobby, swiped his keycard, and climbed the stairs. Every step was a calculation. He reached the door of 4B and paused, listening to the muffled sound of Chad and Ben laughing inside. He did not hesitate. He unlocked the door, stepped into the hallway, and closed it softly behind him. He walked past the living room, ignoring their presence, and went straight to his room to begin the work. Alex cleared his desk, laying out the micro-cameras like surgical instruments. He worked in silence, his breath steady. He disassembled a heavy brass clock, carefully tucking the lens behind the glass face so it pointed directly at the kitchen entrance. The mechanism ticked, masking the faint click of the installation. He moved to the kitchen, his movements fluid and rehearsed. He waited until he heard Chad and Ben retreat to their own rooms before he began the next phase. He unscrewed the cap of a spice jar, hollowed out the center, and embedded a camera lens into the label. He placed the jar on the counter, aligning it to capture the entire workspace. He repeated the process with a decorative vase. Every angle was covered. He checked the feed on his tablet, adjusting the focus until the image was crystal clear. The kitchen appeared on the display, a perfect, silent stage, waiting for his tormentors to walk into the trap. Alex moved into the kitchen, his pulse steady. He took a crisp $50 bill from his wallet and smoothed it out on the granite counter. Beside it, he laid a thick, official-looking envelope, carefully sealed and addressed to himself. It was a perfect lure. He stepped back, checking the angle of the spice jar camera one last time. The screen on his tablet confirmed the view was perfect. Suddenly, the floorboards in the hallway creaked. Alex froze, his hand hovering over the tablet. He grabbed the device and ducked into the pantry. He held his breath, listening to the heavy, familiar thud of footsteps approaching. Chad and Ben were talking, their voices loud and careless. Alex watched the live feed on his screen. The kitchen was empty, save for the bait sitting innocently under the bright overhead lights. He saw a shadow stretch across the floor as the door swung open. They were here. The silence in the pantry was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic thumping of his own heart as the trap began to close. Chad reached the counter first, his fingers closing over the $50 bill with a sharp, greedy snap. He held it up, laughing as he turned to Ben. Ben leaned in, his eyes fixed on the envelope. He tore it open with a single, violent motion, tossing the paper aside as if it were trash. They stood under the bright lights, gloating, their voices filled with a casual cruelty that echoed through the pantry walls. Alex watched the tablet screen, his eyes locked on the high-definition feed. The camera captured the exact moment Chad stuffed the cash into his pocket, and Ben crumpled the fake letter into a ball, dropping it onto the floor. They were relaxed, confident, and completely unaware of the lens embedded in the spice jar. They spent several minutes pacing the kitchen, recounting their day with a smug sense of entitlement. Alex tapped the screen, hitting the save command. The file indicator glowed, confirming the footage was secure. He watched them leave the room, their laughter fading into the hallway. The evidence was undeniable. He pulled the tablet back into the darkness, his hands steady. The trap had worked perfectly. Alex stepped out of the apartment, the tablet pressed firmly against his chest. He moved through the campus quad, keeping his head down. He avoided the main walkways where Chad and Ben were known to hold court, slipping through the narrow service alleys behind the library. He reached the administration building and climbed the stairs, his grip on the device tightening. He bypassed the reception desk. He knocked once, hard, and entered before waiting for a response. The dean looked up from her desk, her expression shifting from annoyance to concern. Alex did not speak. He walked to the desk, placed the tablet down, and tapped the play icon. The screen illuminated the room. The dean leaned forward, her eyes scanning the video as the audio of Chad and Ben gloating filled the quiet office. She watched the theft of the cash and the destruction of the mail in silence. Her jaw tightened. She looked up at Alex, her gaze sharp and focused. The evidence was clear, undeniable, and a federal offense. She reached for her phone, her fingers moving with cold, professional efficiency. The dean placed a brief, authoritative call to the student housing office. She spoke only a few sentences, her tone devoid of warmth. Minutes later, the heavy oak door to the administration office creaked open. Chad and Ben stepped inside, moving with the practiced ease of men who had never been questioned. They carried themselves with an air of effortless superiority, their movements synchronized and relaxed. Chad led the way, his head tilted back, a faint, practiced smile playing on his lips. Ben followed close behind, his hands tucked into his pockets, scanning the room with casual interest. They did not look at the dean with apprehension. They looked at her, as if expecting a commendation. They stood in the center of the office, waiting for the dean to speak, their posture open and unconcerned. The air in the room felt heavy. She watched them for a long moment, her expression unreadable, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Chad shifted his weight. They were entirely unaware of the tablet face down on the desk, or the weight of the evidence that was about to shatter their reality. The dean did not offer them a seat. She reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the tablet, and slid it across the polished mahogany surface until it rested directly in front of Chad. With a slow, deliberate motion, she tapped the screen. The room filled with the sharp, clear audio of their own voices. On the display, the kitchen of apartment 4B appeared in high-definition detail. Chad and Ben watched as their digital counterparts laughed, their hands tearing through an envelope with casual malice. The sound of the paper ripping echoed against the office walls, amplified and inescapable. Chad's smile vanished instantly, replaced by a rigid, frozen expression. He leaned forward, his eyes darting across the screen, searching for a glitch or a reason to deny what he saw. Ben stood motionless, his hands pulling from his pockets as his jaw went slack. The color drained from their faces, leaving them ashen and hollow. They were no longer the campus icons. They were caught in the act, their cruelty laid bare in a loop of undeniable digital evidence. The video continued, showing them gloating over the stolen cash. Every word they spoke on the recording acted like a physical blow. They stood paralyzed, the arrogance that had defined their existence dissolving into a desperate, silent panic. The silence in the office was shattered by the heavy click of the door handle turning from the outside. Chad turned his head, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. Two police officers stepped into the room. their presence filling the space with a sudden, sharp reality. The dean stood up, her movements precise and final. She gestured toward the tablet, then toward the two men standing before her. Chad tried to speak, but no sound emerged. Ben took a half-step back, his heels catching on the edge of the rug. One of the officers moved forward, the metallic sound of handcuffs shifting against his belt. This was a federal investigation into mail theft. The officer stepped into the boy's personal space. Chad's gaze dropped to the floor, his shoulders slumping. Reputation and future were being dismantled. They stood motionless as the officers prepared to secure them. The office door swung wide, and the officers marched them into the main corridor. The transition was jarring. From the sterile, quiet office, they were thrust into the heart of the university. Students stopped in their tracks. Conversations died out, replaced by a sudden, heavy silence that rippled through the hallway as the pair appeared in steel restraints. Chad kept his eyes fixed on the linoleum floor, his jaw tight, refusing to meet the stares of his peers. Ben stumbled slightly, his momentum broken by the firm grip of the officer behind him. Every step they took felt like a public autopsy. People who had once sought their approval now watched with cold, unblinking curiosity. Phones were raised, capturing the moment. The weight of the collective gaze was suffocating. There were no cheers, no support, only the rhythmic sound of their footsteps. They were no longer icons. They were just two people caught in the machinery of justice, passing through the wreckage. The campus was quiet, but the administrative offices were a flurry of activity. Within 48 hours, the university's disciplinary board reached a unanimous decision. The evidence was too vast to ignore. While Chad and Ben sat in holding, investigators entered apartment 4B to secure the premises. They pulled back the floorboards beneath the bed and emptied the back of the closet, uncovering a hidden cache of stolen mail. It was not just Alex's letters. There were dozens of envelopes, some opened, some still sealed, belonging to students across the campus. The sheer volume of the theft turned a personal grudge into a systematic criminal operation. The dean did not wait for a formal hearing. The expulsion letters were drafted, signed, and delivered to the police station before the second day ended. Their status as campus icons was officially voided. The university issued a brief, cold statement to the student body, confirming the termination of their enrollment due to criminal activity. Their influence had vanished, leaving only the physical proof of their greed scattered across the dean's desk. The fall was complete, absolute, and irreversible. The heavy oak door of the dean's office opened, and Alex stepped inside. The air felt different here. The dean sat behind her desk, a single folder resting on the polished wood. She slid it across the surface. It was an emergency transfer packet, granting him immediate placement into the prestigious honor studio. Alex opened the folder, his fingers tracing the embossed seal. This was the space he had earned. He gathered his belongings, leaving the memory of apartment 4B behind him. He entered the studio, a quiet, sun-drenched space filled with drafting tables and high-end equipment. He set his bag down on a clean, empty desk. For the first time, the path ahead was entirely his own, unburdened by the shadows of those who had tried to erase him. The balcony of the honors studio caught the last of the evening light. Alex stepped out, the metal railing cool against his palms. Below, the campus was a grid of paths and buildings, the same landscape he had navigated while under the constant threat of sabotage. He looked down at the courtyard, watching students move between classes, their lives unfolding in patterns he now understood with total clarity. He leaned forward, resting his weight on the ledge. The silence of the studio behind him was not the oppressive, heavy quiet of apartment 4B. It was a space of his own making. He thought back to the months of theft, the ruined mail, and the constant gaslighting. He had stayed quiet then, not because he was afraid, but because he was watching. He had learned to map their movements, to anticipate their cruelty, and to wait for the exact moment when their arrogance would leave them exposed. Silence had been his most effective tool. He watched the sun dip below the horizon, the sky shifting from gold to a deep, steady violet. He was an observer, finally in control. Alex pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen illuminated his face in the fading light. He opened the folder labeled Evidence. It contained the high-definition footage of the kitchen, the audio of the theft, and the digital logs of the mail tampering. He scrolled through the thumbnails one last time. Each frame was a record of a threat that no longer existed. He tapped the selection tool, highlighting every file. His thumb hovered over the trash icon. He pressed it. A prompt appeared. Delete all items permanently? He tapped. Yes. The progress bar filled, then vanished. The folder was empty. The storage space returned to 0. He locked the screen and set the device on the table. The digital weight of the last few months was gone. He turned back to the balcony railing, looking out at the dark campus. The shadows of apartment 4B had no hold here. He breathed in the cool air, turned away from the window, and walked into the quiet, empty studio. The past was deleted. The future was his.